Now, first of all, let's clear something. In the media, in the West, and amongst leading politicians in Western imperialism, in Britain, in the United States, and so on, there is a constant anti-Chinese campaign. China is bad. China is doing all these bad things, which they're obviously also doing themselves. But never mind, China is very bad. China is scheming and manipulating, is apparently paying some people in Westminster to influence politicians, as if this never happens in this country, and stuff like that. Now, this is not an anti-China talk, but this is a communist attempt to understand what China is and what role does China play in world relations. We are internationalists, and we do not support our own ruling class. We do not defend the rights of our own imperialist ruling class. We want to analyze the situation from the point of view of the interests of the working class in China, the working class in the world. It is important for communists to understand world relations and where this comes from. Now, the share of the private sector. I'm trying to use Chinese official figures, but some of these figures need to be taken, no, I wouldn't say with a pinch of salt, but they need to be understood, because sometimes the definitions of what is a privately owned company or mixed company or state company is a bit complicated and doesn't necessarily correspond to what we would normally understand. But according to Chinese official figures, the private sector defined restrictively as firms with less than 10% state participation in the first half of 2023 was about 40% of GDP. This is one figure that you can look at. But this was the lowest that this figure was since 2019. During the pandemic and so on, private sector has decreased a little bit, and the state sector has correspondingly increased. But the private sector actually reached the private sector reached a peak of 55% of GDP around 2021. But I think there's not just the share, the strength, the weight of the private sector, but also it's important to look at the arrow. Where's the arrow pointing? What's the direction of the process? In 2010, the private sector defined in this way was only 8% of the GDP, and is now 40. It's been 50%, and so on. According to also official figures, 80% of the industrial workforce, i.e. workers who work specifically in industry, 80% of the industrial workforce is in the private sector. The private sector contributes 50% of exports, and exports are obviously an important part of the Chinese economy, more so than in some other capitalist countries. In 2011, i.e. when this process was still at the beginning or starting, or had started maybe 10 years earlier or so, the Chinese minister, the spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, he said, after 30 years of reform and opening up, China has completed the transformation from a planned economy to a market economy. This was the official position of the Chinese state back in 2010. You also have to take this with a slight pinch of salt, because at that time they were in negotiations about joining the WTO and whether the Chinese economy should be considered a planned economy or not, and so on, for other reasons. But that gives you an idea of what the situation is. I will say that for some years now, it cannot be contested that the Chinese state defends and promotes capitalist property relations. Yes, China is a capitalist country in which the state plays a big role in the economy. This is because of its history and other factors, i.e. coming from a planned economy onto a capitalist economy. But nevertheless, the state sector is used in order to defend and promote and foster capitalist property relations. And what dominates in China is not economic planning, but rather the capitalist private profit motive. And this is how the capitalist economy works in China. This process, as I said, took over 30 years. And another interesting factor is that the Chinese capital abroad, i.e. Chinese capitalists from other countries, played a big role in the development of capitalism in China. They were the first ones to invest in private companies, bring plants into China and so on. But obviously international capital also played a big role. And this was a big part of what in the 1990s was called the process of globalization, the integration of China into the capitalist market, massive investment by Western companies in China, which they originally used as a source of cheap labor. This is what they were looking for. They were looking for cheap labor in order to be able to produce cheaply. And as an aside, this played a big role for the whole period of time in keeping inflation down in the advanced capitalist countries. And this was an important part of the political and economic situation in the 1990s and beyond. Now, a question that can be asked, is a legitimate question, is how is it possible that a backward-dominated country, as China was before the Chinese Revolution in 1949, has now become a powerful part of the world economy, a powerful developed capitalist economy? If you read Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, it says that the national bourgeois in dominated countries, in backward capitalist countries, in the epoch of imperialism, cannot play a progressive role and cannot carry out the tasks of the bourgeois revolution, the national democratic revolution. But China is different, because in China is not the capitalist class, the Chinese bourgeois, which has carried out those tasks, but it was the Chinese Revolution which abolished capitalism and went a long way in solving the national democratic tasks in China, which are mainly the agrarian reform, with the expropriation of landlordism, and the question of national unification and national sovereignty. China in 1990, in 2000, was not a backward country dominated by imperialism. It was an independent country where many of the tasks of the National Democratic Revolution had been solved decades earlier. And this was the basis on which capitalist development started in China. On top of this, there were other elements to this. The fact that there was a strong state, there was universal education, high level of education and cultural level, allowed China to catch up with a number of advanced technologies and so on. China as well has not only become a capitalist country, it's become a capitalist country that's changed its character in the international division of labor. It was originally, as I said, a country dominated by cheap labor and the export of cheap commodities, toys, textiles, cheap electronic goods, and so on. But it is now no longer that, or those sectors, those features of the capitalist economy that China was maybe 20 years ago, are no longer dominant in China, I would argue. Right now, China has moved towards a higher technology and higher wages economy. The average, let me get this right, I think it's either the average or the median. Anyway, the average wage in China today is about $1,300. That disguises a lot of regional disparities, but that will make Chinese workers' wages higher than wages, for instance, in Albania, in Romania, in Mexico, and in other countries where capitalists go looking for cheap labor. And that creates a number of consequences. There are now some companies, for different reasons, but one reason is wages, that are moving away from China or away from the coastal areas that are more economically developed into cheaper labor areas, or into other cheaper labor economies in Asia, or into other cheaper labor economies that are closer to the capitalist markets these companies want to serve. And also,
is that $1,300 a month?
sorry, yeah, $1,300 a month, $1,300 a month. And then the Chinese economy has adopted very advanced technologies. In some sectors, Chinese technology is ahead of other capitalist, imperialist countries. Just to give one example, you know, for instance, about electric vehicles, which is a growing sector of the capitalist economy. And electric vehicles are no longer, I'm not an engineer by any stretch of imagination, but what I understand is that the most important thing in an electric vehicle is not so much the engine, but the battery and the range that this battery might have, and so on. Now there is a Chinese company called CATL. This is the largest maker of electric vehicle batteries in the world, and controls 34% of the world's market for electric vehicle batteries. And it's well ahead of any other company and supplies all the major car manufacturers in the world, including Tesla, Ford, Volvo, which is obviously no longer a Swedish multinational, but a multinational that has now been bought off by Chinese capital, and so on. Just to give you one example. And how has China achieved that? Well, by the traditional methods of a capitalist country, by stealing technology, by sending thousands of students to study in the most prestigious universities in Britain, in the United States, to try to investing a lot of money in research and development campuses, and basically by investing in a series of sectors that they think are sectors that are the future of capitalist economy, and therefore gaining an advantage over other countries. This is also, I will say, part of the combined and uneven development. A formerly backward economy can jump ahead in certain sectors. China, for instance, has an advantage that it never had a massive car manufacturing, traditional fuel car manufacturing industry as the West has. And therefore the transition to electric vehicles is much faster. And this can be replicated in many other sectors of the economy. Its role in the world, China's role in the world, has also changed. And I will argue that China is playing an imperialist role in the world economy and in world relations. Now, what does imperialism mean? Imperialism, when we talk about imperialism from a communist point of view, we don't mean the general common sense understanding of imperialism as in an aggressive foreign policy, military invasions, and so on. That is part of imperialism. But if you look at Lenin's definition of imperialism, the classic features that Lenin describes in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, these are, try to summarize, the concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it creates monopolies, which play a decisive role in the economic life. Number two, the merging of banking capital with industrial capital and the creation of finance capital. Number three, the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities, which acquires an exceptional importance. Four, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world amongst themselves. And number five, the territorial division of the world amongst the biggest capitalist powers becomes complete. These are Lenin's definition of imperialism, the imperialist stage of capitalism. You will see that Lenin is talking about a world system. He's not trying to define one country by ticking 5 boxes. This is what he describes as a world system, the division of the world between the biggest capitalist powers. I will argue that China fulfills all of this in one degree or another, all of these different conditions, and is now part of the world imperialist system. First of all, as I said, China is dominated by big monopolies. Chinese companies are huge, and these huge companies dominate a very large percentage of the total of the Chinese economy. Just to give you one example, and these monopolies have a projection in the world economy. Just to give you an indication, a total of 135 Chinese companies figure in the Forbes 500 list of the biggest companies in the world. 135. the United States, and Japan. The United States has 136. Japan has 41 in the list. So China has more or less the same number of huge companies in this 500 top list. And this has now been the case for some years. I'm talking about the Forbes 500 list for the year 2023. Finance also dominates the Chinese economy, and there's a fusion between finance capital and industrial capital that's very marked in China. The 4 largest banks in the world, there's different ways of measuring size. It's, say, in the amount of deposits, value of capitalization, number of workers. But by one measure, at least, China possesses the 4 largest banks in the world, that are the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, the China Construction Bank, the Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China. These are the 4 largest banks in the world, and they play a big role in China's economy. They also play a big role in the world economy. China also exports capital for some time now. This has been a process. If you look at the graph of the Chinese export of capitals, it goes like this. Sorry, it goes like this. Up, 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 up. From approximately 2005, particularly after 2010, and is now very, very high. Of course, there are certain things that have been happening in the last 2 or 3 years, the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, and all of this, which have distorted the disruption of world trade, supply chains, and so on. This has disrupted some of these patterns. But up until that point, the curve was very upwards. Just to give you an indication. Oh, here it is. China's outgoing foreign direct investment began to rise after 2000. The annual flow of China's outward foreign investment jumped from 2.7 billion US dollars in 2002 to 196 billion, say, let's call it 200 billion US dollars in 2016. That's in the space of about 15 years. It multiplied by 100. I'm not a maths expert, as you can see, but it seems to me that this is multiplication by 100. I'll just give you some other figures. These are figures of the top 10 countries and regions in the world as sources of outward foreign direct investment stock and annual flow, right? So and this is figures for 2015, right? And the source is the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. In 2015, in terms of stock, i.e. accumulated foreign direct investment, the USA was at the top with 23% share of the global foreign direct investment stock. China was number 8 at only 4.4%. But Hong Kong which is accounted separately, was 4th at 5.9%. In terms of total stock, i.e. the accumulated in foreign direct investment over a period of time at the point of 2015. But in terms of flow, i.e. the money that goes out every year as foreign direct investment, the US in 2015 was still number 1 with 20% of share of the total global foreign direct investment flow. China was number 2 with 10%, i.e. half of China, half of the United States, sorry. And Hong Kong was number 9 with 3.7%. If you add Hong Kong to China, that makes about 13.7, 13.6%, which is not that far from the outward foreign direct investment for the United States at that point in 2015. Of course, foreign direct investment is a very misguiding category. Some of this money is then stashed in tax havens, in the Cayman Islands, in the Seychelles, or in other tax havens like this. But quite a lot of this does go into foreign direct investment. mergers and acquisitions. We have seen China pursuing very aggressively. Perhaps aggressively is not the right word. This is the word the Western imperialists will use. But very, what's another word for aggressive that's not so, very strongly promoting investment of Chinese companies in buying and investing in other countries, in all sorts of things, which I will go into in a minute. China's foreign aid expenditure, this is also another form of imperialism, because we know foreign aid is not really foreign aid. It's about getting political clout. It's about getting countries dependent on your foreign aid and so on. Foreign aid, which was a very small amount in China, but is growing very fast. The last figure I could find was for 2003. This is a long time ago. But at that time, China was using in foreign aid 2.3 billion US dollars. Oh, sorry, I'm getting this wrong. It says here, from 600 million in 2003 to 2.3 billion in 2016. Now, 2.3 billion puts China in the range of medium-sized capitalist countries like, say, Belgium, Australia, in terms of spending in foreign aid, in inverted commas. China's, yes, I think these are the figures for export of capital. I will go a bit more into this in a minute. Monopolies, we already said. Finance, we already said. And then finally, there's this question of the division of the world between the main imperialist powers. And China is now part of this. It's quite clearly part of this. If you probably heard of the Road and Belt Initiative, also known as the New Silk Road. What's that mean? China is attempting to spend a lot of money into doing what? Into securing shipping and trading lanes for its export products, trading routes, also securing sources of energy and raw materials for its hungry industrial development, and also securing fields of investment and chaining a whole number of countries to its area of influence through the export of capital, through investment, and so on. And this, quite clearly, has led China into an open conflict with the United States. And we can see that on many different aspects. There's now the beginning or elements of a trade war between China and the United States, which started at the time of the Trump presidency, but which has continued with the Biden administration. It's not a partisan policy. It's a capitalist ruling class of the United States policy. And you have seen incidents of this. For instance, the United States lobbied Britain very strongly not to allow Huawei into the bidding for 5G infrastructure contracts. And why is this? Because right now, Huawei, which many of you might think as a maker of cheap telephones, mobile phones, Huawei is now one of the main players in 5G infrastructure in the world. This is a very sharp development of technology, and China is at the top in this technology. And there's other cases of this. United States is lobbying Brazil very hard not to allow Huawei in. Was it Canada arrested some Huawei executives? And all of this is nothing to do with industrial espionage or worrying about the Whitehall mobile phones being listened to into by China. There might be an element of that, but it's basically the competition between different capitalist companies. And incidentally, this also proves another point. Some people 20 years ago or so, they were arguing that imperialism didn't exist anymore, that what we had was empire, a one world conglomerate of companies that dominate. No. Imperialism does exist and is divided in between different warring and competing imperialist powers. And China defends the interests of Huawei, and the United States defends the interests of Boeing, and the European Union defends the interests of Airbus in the world market by any means necessary that are available at their disposal. Now, okay, this, as I said, brings China into conflict with the United States. This is very clear, and this conflict is manifested on many different fields. Right now, China Right now, China is not using military power to secure its imperialist interests. So far, I will add. And that makes some people say, oh, but the Chinese investment in Africa is friendly investment. It's not like imperialists that organize military coups and so on, and they send gunboats and this and that. Yeah, that is true, but that doesn't make Chinese investment of a different characteristic as imperialist investment from other countries. China is not using military power to exercise its imperialist interest abroad because it's not able to yet, right? China is still much weaker than the United States in military terms, though it's catching up in a whole number of areas. The United States has built its military power all around the world for a very long period of time and so on. So China is using mainly finance, diplomacy, and so on. However, it has to be said that China has already built a military base in Djibouti. Djibouti is obviously a very important choke point for international trade at the mouth of the Red Sea. And several of the harbors that are being built or have been built through the Road and Belt Initiative have a dual or potentially have a dual military civilian use. Part of this is US propaganda, but part of this is also potentially true. And the classic pattern is the following for Chinese foreign investment in different countries. A Chinese state-owned bank lends money to country A. Country A then uses this money in order to carry out some big infrastructure projects, an electro-generating power dam, hydroelectrical power station, railway, the improvement of the capacity of a harbor to offer service to bigger ships and so on. And then this infrastructure project is usually carried out by Chinese infrastructure companies, Chinese civil construction, railway construction companies. Chinese companies then operate this said infrastructure project. For instance, Chinese railway company operates the railway, a Chinese harbor, a Chinese COSCO, for instance, or other big Chinese harbor companies take over. And then, in exchange for this investment, which is in the form of a loan, which means this country is now in debt with China. In exchange for this, China gets rights to the exploitation of minerals or other natural resources, preferential trading in soybeans or meat, and other things like this. And these infrastructure projects, interestingly, link the raw materials that this country possesses to harbors from which they're going to be shipped to China. These projects are then put as collateral for this debt. If this country, as it often happens, defaults on its debt, then the Chinese get full control of these infrastructures that have been built. And this all builds debt and political leverage and creates a relationship which cannot be described as in any other way that there's between an imperialist country and a dominated country. And this is happening everywhere. It's happening in the whole of Africa, in Latin America, in many Asian countries. And I can give you many examples. For instance, amongst other things, China has developed a string of investments in harbors around the world that they think are crucial for the shipping lanes. And if you look at the map, you will be surprised. I was surprised when I looked at the map. Let's put it this way. I don't know if you're going to be surprised or not. But China has now control or investment. In some cases, it's a small investment, 10% share, 30% share. In other cases, it's a dominant position in all the main shipping lanes around the world. The Malacca Straits, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia. Then obviously they have this big harbor in Sri Lanka. Then there's the Wadar harbor that they built in Pakistan, which also means that there's going to be a land connecting route through Central Asia. Incidentally, all of this also bypasses China, which is a traditional enemy of bypasses India, which which is a traditional enemy of China in the world relations. And then from Gwadar, you go to Djibouti, the harbor that I mentioned before, which is built and owned by a Chinese company. Then on the other side of the Red Sea, the mouth of the Red Sea, there's the port of Aden, which is also invested by the Chinese. On the Mediterranean side, you have Port Said in Egypt, in the mouth of the Suez Canal. The Haifa harbor in Israel. Then you go to the port of Piraeus in Greece, which is wholly owned by a Chinese company, COSCO. Then you go to some of the harbors in the north of Italy, the harbor in Valencia in Spain, the port, I think it's called the Europort in Algiers in Morocco. Then you go all the way up to the port of Bilbao, the port of a number of ports in France, but also Dunkirk, and Nikolaev, which are now obviously not very useful. But they have investments like this. And then also on the Pacific side, China has investments in the port of Los Angeles and the port of Seattle, the two of the biggest ports of the Pacific coast, and is now building a port in a new harbor in Chancay in Peru, which is going to cut the time that the trading takes between China and South America by 5 to 10 days. So that just gives you an idea of what they're trying to do. They're trying to secure shipping and trading routes, which is it's not an evil thing. It's plotting and scheming is the behavior of an imperialist country that wants to secure its interests in the world. I'll just give you one example. For instance, in Zambia is a landlocked country in southern Africa, which is very rich in copper. So the Chinese have invested. They have rights for the extraction of copper in Zambia. Zambia is now heavily indebted to China. The Chinese have now built and renovated a railway line that connects the mines in Zambia to the Dar es Salaam harbor in Tanzania, in order to extract copper, also other important minerals for the development of new technologies. And guess what? The Chinese are building the Tazara railway line, which will connect, the Tazara railway line is the other one that I just mentioned, but they're building another, a series of other railways that will connect the Indic Ocean coast with the Congo. One that goes through, that connects Rwanda, Malawi, Burundi with Uganda, another one that connects Kenya with Djibouti, and so on. The idea of this is to extract this, to provide a proper, fast way of extracting these raw materials from these important areas of the world. Nairobi to Mombasa, Addis Ababa to Djibouti, and there are many other examples like this. In Ecuador is heavily indebted with China, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, etc. The same thing is happening in the whole of South America. Now China has become the main, about 2 years ago, China became the main trading partner for the whole of South America. And this is quite damaging from the point of view of the interest of US imperialism. US imperialism has always, for 200 years, about 200 years ago, this year, the Monroe Doctrine was enunciated, and the Monroe Doctrine says America for the Americans, which basically means the America is the backyard of US imperialism, and no other imperialist powers will be allowed to have any say in the whole of America. Well, now you have China, which is the main trading partner with the whole of South America, particularly countries like Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia. All these countries, what's the character of this trade with China? The character of this trade is that China purchases raw materials, copper, beef, pork, oil, gas, lithium, soybeans, contributing, by the way, to the deforestation of whole regions of South America, and sells manufactured goods. Machinery, transport equipment, manufactured goods, and chemicals are the main items that China exports. At the same time, China invests money in Latin America through foreign direct investment. China has bought the electricity grid in many of the Brazilian states. And Chinese companies, Chinese privately owned car companies, electric vehicle companies, BYD, and what's the other one? Great Wall Motors, have now bought 2 big plants, car plants in Brazil, one that was formerly owned by Ford and one that was formerly owned by, was it Volkswagen or General Motors? I'm not totally sure. Two Western imperialist companies have left Brazil, and this has been taken over now by 2 Chinese companies that are going to build electric vehicles. Incidentally, the world's largest manufacturer of electric vehicles is now BYD, although these figures are a bit of a trick because BYD produces both pure electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles, while Tesla, which is the main competitor, produces only electric vehicles. So it's not a same by same comparison, but it's up there. Okay, so I'd say that this demonstrates the fact that China is an imperialist country, and this has certain consequences and certain implications. Some people say that this is a positive feature. The role that China plays in the world economy is a positive feature because this means that we now have or can hope for a multipolar world that is no longer dominated by US imperialism, and therefore this is a better thing, that the peoples of the world, particularly in the oppressed countries, now have a freer room to develop. But this is I don't want to use a strong word, but this is completely wrong, because there is no advantage for the working class in advanced capitalist countries or in dominated capitalist countries, that instead of the world being dominated or mostly dominated by one imperialist country, which wasn't, in any case, wasn't the case before, but the US clearly played a much more dominant role in the past, say 20 years ago than it plays now. Instead of that, now we have different imperialist powers fighting for control over different countries. This doesn't improve the situation of the working people, the poor peasants and the poor people in the oppressed nations of the world. It doesn't. It just means there is more conflict. There are more regional wars between the two of them. If anyone attended the talk yesterday about the situation in Africa and French imperialism, you can see that clearly. That is not an improvement. The workers of the world, their interest is to fight against all imperialist powers, not to fight so that different imperialist powers balance each other off. It is true, however, that the fact that China now plays a bigger role in the world economy allows certain countries around the world to try to balance one power against the other and change slightly their allegiances. I'm coming to an end. And change their allegiances. For instance, we have seen a whole number of countries that were in the past very close allies of the United States, or let me rephrase that. They were basically puppets of the United States. They were completely dominated by the United States. Countries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia or even Brazil, for instance. They now in the world politics are trying to play a more independent role. It doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia has cut off its links with the United States. No, they're trying to play China off against the United States in order to gain a bit of an advantage for themselves. This is not beneficial for Saudi Arabian workers. We're still under the yoke of a semi-feudal reactionary monarchy. Many of them are foreign immigrant workers in conditions of no rights and very low wages and high exploitation. But this means that Saudi Arabia is able to, for instance, in the conflict in Ukraine, it's clear that Saudi Arabia has been leaning towards helping Russia keep oil prices up and trading with Russia in oil. There are other factors in this. The fact that now the United States is almost self-sufficient in terms of oil, which wasn't the case in the past. There's other factors, but clearly, if you were watching the world this year, you realize that there was a peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was brokered by China. And this means that the United States are no longer playing a dominant role in the Middle East as they were able to play in the past. Now, the other thing we need to say is that this process has certain limits. We're not saying that China is growing, its influence in the world is growing, its role as an imperialist power is growing, and at some point it will overtake the United States and become the main imperialist power in the world. We're not saying that. Why we're not saying that? Because this process has certain limits, which I think the Chinese economy is more or less now reached. China's economy has been for many years heavily investing in gross capital formation, i.e. building machinery, factories, industries, and is now facing a classic capitalist crisis of overproduction. It can produce too much steel, too many cars, and too many of everything they can't sell at any place. And it's a classic crisis of capitalism. It's also a crisis of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The same amount of investment in machinery and technology in China does no longer produce the same amount of GDP growth as it did in the past. It's still growing, but it is not the same as in the past. And also there are some other factors. There's a factor that the Chinese and the US economy are extremely interconnected. And therefore there are US companies in whose interest it is not that there is a trade war. Like, for instance, Foxconn is a huge industrial enterprise in China that builds most of the Apple phones that people use in the West. They are not interested in a trade war, obviously, and there are many other Western companies that are invested in China that are playing a restraining role. And you see from time to time Western capitalist leaders going to China for a trade conference and so on, trying to return to normal diplomatic relations and so on. This is another reason. But finally, the United States as a world imperialist power, its role has declined, but this decline is still a relative decline. Not only is it still the biggest economy in the world, sometimes people say, oh, but China has already overtaken the United States as the biggest economy, or will overtake the United States. Yeah, but China has a much bigger population than the United States. This means that the productivity of labor in the United States is still much higher than in China overall, because China is also a very unequal country. Not the same thing, the coastal areas where most of the capitalist development has taken place, but the areas in the interior were still lagging behind, and so on. And in terms of military power, the United States is still far ahead. China has, just to give you an example, China has, I think, 2 aircraft carriers only, and the United States has, I can't remember how many, but many more. And in many other areas, this is the case. So I think that while this situation obviously leads to more tensions, more potential for regional wars and local wars in the world relations, it does not mean that China will overtake the United States anytime soon, because China is facing up to its own limits. Last point I want to make is, what is the position of communists in relation to all this? The position of communists is the following. The position of communists is the main enemy of the working class is at home. We are sitting here in the UK or in the United States. Our main enemy is not China. Our main enemy is the ruling class in this country. And our allies are the workers of the world, including the workers in China. This is the interesting point. The economic development, the development of capitalism in China has created a powerful working class, a working class that has no traditions, no recent traditions of struggle. There have been many strikes and so on, but it doesn't have a long established tradition of reformist parties and trade unions and so on. It's a fresh working class. Many of them are first generation migrants from the countryside into the cities. They're working in conditions of high exploitation. And as I'm describing this, some of you might be thinking this is the same thing or similar parallels between this and what happened in Russia in 1917, or what happened in Spain in 1970, or what happened in Brazil in 1980. A first generation working class and the conditions of dictatorship where there's no avenues for legal trade union or political development, in conditions of high exploitation, where the conditions have changed very quickly over a short period of time. And this leads to what? A revolutionary explosion. And this is what's being prepared in China. And our task is to link up with the Chinese working class and to fight together to overthrow imperialism and capitalism around the world. Not to celebrate that now there are more imperialist countries and the world is more multipolar, but rather to strengthen our resolve to fight against capitalism and imperialism, which are the main source of wars and exploitation, a system that's already outlived any useful role that they might have played in the past.